begin. Hi everyone, my name is Daria Shapovalova and I am the chair of the Scottish Arctic Network. I work at the University of Aberdeen and it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, who's Dr Keith Torrance from the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. And it is a particularly interesting talk for me personally because we don't usually get engineers talking about remediation and work with Indigenous communities. There's quite a big split, I feel like, in the Arctic science, where social scientists are doing one thing and then the physical scientists are doing another thing. So it's great to see some interdisciplinary work coming together in here. For some practicalities, we are recording the webinar, so it's something to keep in mind. It is also our final webinar for the series, so it is our pleasure to welcome Keith to deliver it. And we are going to have the talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, and there will be an opportunity for some questions and discussion afterwards. So if you have any questions, then you can either type them in the chat, or you can just unmute yourself at the end and ask them online. So without further ado, I will pass the virtual floor to Keith.
Great. Well, thank you, Daria, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about something I'm very passionate about, and that's Arctic Alaska. I'm a research fellow at the University of Strathclyde, but prior to that, I lived and worked in Anchorage, Alaska, for around about 8 years, working for a number of engineering companies, including companies that were actually run by some of the native village corporations as we have in Alaska. And I'll talk about that when we look at one of the case studies. So this is kind of what I'm going to try and cover today. There will probably be some deviations from this, and I'm also happy to talk about other things that perhaps the audience is interested. And I'll begin really by talking about contaminated sites in Alaska. I also want to talk about one specific case study at the former Naval Arctic Research Laboratory in Utqiagvik, Alaska. And then kind of finally talk about some of the impacts of climate change, which are very real in Alaska. I know the kind of media impression is that the United States is very hard set against the notion of climate change, but it's actually very different in Alaska because the effects are already being experienced by people there. Great, so you're probably all familiar where Alaska is. This is kind of a view across the pole. You can see that although we are some distance apart, there are a couple of similarities. Juneau, which is the capital of the state of Alaska, is actually on the same latitude as Wick in Scotland, but obviously a large portion of the state is actually above the Arctic Circle. Another similar point is most populations live a very short distance from the coast in both the state and countries. And both areas, I shouldn't say countries, of course, have a mature oil industry that has a declining oil production. Scotland, obviously, in the North Sea, Alaska in the Prudhoe Bay oil fields. So just another map. I'm sure some of you have been to Alaska. Most people tend to do a cruise up from Vancouver and stop at a lot of the cities or towns rather on the Panhandle, finishing up in Anchorage and maybe going as far as Fairbanks or Denali to see the wonderful national park there. What is more difficult is really to go beyond these areas, because a large portion of the states essentially has no roads. So the only way to get there is by plane. For places like Utqiagvik, there is a good jet service there, but the majority of communities in the interior of Alaska or on the coast can only really be visited by, small airline services, typically a small plane, prop plane with maybe 4 or 5 seats at most, which tends to be quite expensive to do. So, environmental issues, they have a very high profile in Alaska. There's been a number of projects that have gained a lot of attention, primarily the Pebble Mine in southwest Alaska. There's also been ongoing development around Prudhoe Bay, such as the Willow Oil Project. There's also a lot of concern about the impact of climate change on some of the communities. And, as we'll talk about, some of the communities in Alaska have already had to locate because of not so much rising sea levels as increased erosion of the coastline and frequent flooding. I want to talk about contaminated sites. I describe myself as a geoenvironmental engineer. A lot of the work that I was doing was on contaminated sites within Alaska, primarily in Arctic Alaska. And, it's reasonable to ask, why are there so many contaminated sites in Alaska? We think of it as being kind of pristine last wilderness, but there's almost 8,000 contaminated sites listed in the state contaminated sites database. And there's a number of reasons for that, as I'll be talking about. One of which is that there's a lot of abandoned mines in the state, but by far the vast majority of these sites are related to the military in some form or other. There's also the Prudhoe Bay oil field, which has been in operation now for over 40 years. Over that time, of course, environmental procedures have gotten much better, but it's going to take decades and a lot of money and effort to clean up the site or the oil field once that's finished. To take an example, this is Utqiagvik, formerly known as Barrow, Alaska. It has a population of around about 3,000, but each of these triangles represents a contaminated site in the community. So that gives you an idea of the density of these sites and really why it's such a big issue in Arctic Alaska. And there's a number of reasons for that I'd like to kind of go through and kind of discuss in a little more detail. Firstly, one of the main reasons is just the ubiquitous use of diesel as the main fuel for heating and power in these remote Arctic villages. And all of that fuel has to be brought into the community, typically once a year, offloaded, from a tanker barge, and then, put in some kind of storage facility. And obviously that extensive handling and the fact that a lot of these oil tanks will deteriorate over time creates great potential for spills. And the vast majority of contaminated sites in Alaska, are related to fuel spillages of one type or another. And even going back a little further, most of the military activity in Alaska depended on fuel, of course, but it was brought in to the sites in these 55-gallon drums that you can see here. And this is shows one single location, and you can see all the discarded oil drums in that single facility. And of course, people would use the oil drums to dispose of waste oil and other fluids, and those would get kind of mixed up with the empty drums and create a big problem. So common are these that they're actually known as Arctic daisies, these fuel drums. And of course, some of the initial efforts to address this problem simply involved, digging a hole, putting the drums in it and covering them over. This is Umiat, where we saw that previous slide, and the location that they chose to put all these drums, unfortunately, is being eroded by the Kovo River. So very often these remediation projects are a second attempt to address the problem. And we'll see later how climate change is impacting the location of some of these landfills. Of course, you bring all these empty drums and they get used for storing waste oil in communities, and they get left to rot and cause secondary problems from that. And one of the reasons for that is it's very expensive to ship a drum of waste oil out of the village. It tends to go by plane, so maybe costing $1,000, which is roughly the price of a new drum delivered to these villages. So they tend to stay there, accumulate, and become a problem, as you can see here. The second reason, perhaps the main reason why there's so many sites in Alaska, relates to the presence of the military in the state, with a number of installations typically dating from the Cold War, which you can see there. We shouldn't also forget that the Aleutian Islands in Alaska were the site of some fairly significant battles during World War II, and there's still some remnants and relics and, in fact, contamination from that period. So this is a picture. I've got quite a lot of old photos in this presentation, which I think are very good for giving you an idea of the scope of these activities. This is the village of Kaktovik, probably about 100 or so residents, almost to the border with Canada. And you can see in the photo, first of all, the White Alice site, which are these black structures there in the middle of the photo, and also one of the Dew stations for kind of early warning radar. And these White Alice sites, in an era before satellites were ubiquitous, this was a way for seeing over the horizon, really, with radar. And obviously at that point, the real threat was from the Soviet Union. And in the event of an attack, these stations would give some early warning of that. This is another map. It shows the Seward Peninsula, which is on the west of Alaska. I just wanted to show you the density of some of these, facilities. In this small region, you've got almost 50 sites, some of which are still active today, such as Tin City there, but a number of these are all no longer used. And, the density, you can see the close proximity of Russia would have been the old Soviet Union. From Tin City, it's only a matter of, 20 kilometers or so to the border with Russia there. So these are Air Force bases. There's also a lot of long-range radar stations, again, all keeping an eye on activity from the Soviet Union. But as the threat has receded, at least until the last couple of years, I would say, many of these facilities have been abandoned and are now kind of clean-up sites. And overall in the state, there's around about 750 military sites, which I think equates to about 1 for every 1,000 people living in the state. So quite a high ratio there. Third reason, a lot of mining in the state. In fact, there still are probably about 8 or so active mines in the state, mostly metals, gold, copper, also a coal mine operating, but probably over about 1,000 abandoned mines throughout the state. And you can see this is the Kennecott copper mine. It's now a national park. It was one of the biggest copper mines in the world in the kind of 1920s. Some of the ore that they mined there was about 70% copper, which gives you an idea of how what a good deposit it was. This is another mine site. It's called the Red Devil mine. It mined actually mercury from about the 1930s up to the 1970s. And unfortunately, this is very typical. The last operators of the mine just basically walked away from the site in the mid-1970s and left it as you see it in this photo, complete with the tank farm containing some fuel, all of the waste tailings from the mine, and a lot of material from the smelter was just dumped on the site. Highly contaminated, not only with mercury, as you might expect, but also with arsenic and antimony. And all of those metals eventually find their way into the Kuskokwim River, which is a major fishing river for the communities in the south west of the state there. So these are extremely expensive to clean up, these sites. To give you an idea, because the land is owned by the federal government and managed by the Bureau of Land Management, they are responsible for the cleanup costs. There's no responsible party that can be held to account for the cost of cleaning up this. And some of the estimates some of the options to remediate the site, were in the range of about $800 million. They eventually chose a solution to partially clean up the site, and even then it still cost, close to $200 million, which has to be paid by the poor taxpayer, long-suffering taxpayer. There's also a lot of potential conflict over these sites because the land ownership is really held in trust by the BLM with the intention that it be passed on to the native communities through their native village corporations. But not unexpectedly, those communities want the sites to be cleaned up before they're passed over. So that does kind of give a political dimension to some of these sites there. Another fourth reason here is really the extreme weather, particularly in Arctic Alaska. That's negative 52 degrees Fahrenheit, which is quite commonly reached in places like Fairbank, let alone Arctic Alaska. Being in the Arctic, you've of course got several months without any true daylight, and that puts a lot of pressure on the infrastructure. The metal becomes cold and brittle. It's very easy to rupture a pipe when doing snow clearance, for example, and often issues aren't discovered until the kind of fall. So, infrastructure is a real problem in the Elastic. I mean, take something as basic as sewage. We're all used to being able to have toilets in our house. That can be done in the Arctic. It's very difficult to do because the pipes have to be above ground and heated. And a lot of communities still rely on what's euphemistically known as honey buckets, essentially just a bucket that you use as a toilet. And then these are dumped somewhere in what's known as a honey bucket lagoon. Which, as you can see how shocking these look in the pristine wilderness. This is Anaktuvik Pass with the Brook Range behind it there. And final reason, climate change is accelerating coastal erosion. So a lot of the sites where remediation has been done earlier are now at threat from coastal erosion. Arctic Alaska, it's warming at up to 3 times faster than the rest of the continental USA, and some of these numbers are, pretty worrying. Plus 6 degrees Fahrenheit in the last 50 years on the North Slope, which You know, it's what, about 3 degrees centigrade roughly, maybe a little more, over 50 years. So something like 3 times, you know, what our target is for the rest of the world. And that has some very real impacts, as I'll talk about in the final section. So I wanted to give you a flavour of kind of remediation and characterisation work. This is one project that I worked on. It's actually a series of projects around Utqiagvik or Barrow. It's the very most northerly point of the United States, and Barrow itself has maybe 4,000 full-time residents living there. So, you know, obviously that's quite a strategic point, and there has been a lot of military activity in the area over the decades. Just wanted to show you some of the buildings remaining there from, this was the Naval Arctic Research Laboratory from about 1947 until about 2000, where scientists would live and work in the Arctic on a lot of, you know, military related, but also a lot of, you know, pure research on the Arctic. And that really hasn't changed much. You can see, again, some of these old pictures of Quonset huts with, or Nissen huts, as they call them, you know, which house the laboratories and also the people that lived there. So this is a photo taken in 1962, and I wanted to show this because the actual base itself is built on a gravel pad that was basically bulldozed from the beach to form an area to build the structures. On top of the tundra that you can see there in the foreground. And I wanted just to show you the damage that had been done to the tundra from, you know, vehicles passing over in the summer. You know, which, you know, many years later are still visible. The actual tundra takes a long time to recover from any disturbance there. Now, over most of the North Slope now, travel is only allowed on the tundra, you know, by vehicle during the winter when it's frozen, and you're not likely to damage the sensitive ecosystem. But that obviously wasn't the practice back in the 1960s. So the reason that you build on a gravel pad is because the entire area is underlain by permafrost. So if you don't insulate the buildings from the permafrost, melting of the permafrost will cause the structures to be undermined and ultimately be damaged. And this is kind of how they did things back in the day. They showed up in barges, put all their supplies on the beach, and then hauled them to the base, which kind of looks like this today. I showed you the density of some of the contaminated slides. We're going to kind of zoom in and look at one area. You can see the actual base there in the top of the slide. And again, I just wanted to show you the density of some of the issues there. This Arctic lake, Emikpuk Lake, was also a receptor for a lot of this contamination, as we'll talk about later, specifically some of the firefighting foams that were used on the site. So we're going to zoom in on what's known as the kind of hangar on the airstrip. And there's actually 2 hangar buildings remaining, both of which were the locus of air activities around the base. It was also the site of some fairly catastrophic discharges of fuel. I've kind of highlighted some of the 3 separate spills with almost 350, 400,000 gallons of gasoline that was lost from during pumping operations, which seems a staggering amount. It's almost like somebody kind of put the pipe into the tank, then went home, come back the next day and found out that the pipe had come loose. So huge amounts of fuel was dumped into the site, and remains an issue to this day. A further complication, has been that so this is the actual airstrip itself. You can see that it's not nicely tarmacked, it's all gravel, and they actually use metal sheeting to form the runway. So in terms of spills, it's a very porous surface, and it's very difficult to recover the fuel. We've talked about permafrost. There's about 1 kilometre depth of permafrost. It does melt to some extent in the summer, but maybe only 1 metre or so. So you have quite a complicated hydrological regime. And typically when we have fuel spills, we're really worried about how the fuel is going to travel in the subsurface. And the presence of the permafrost and these kind of thaw cycles greatly complicates that, as you can see in this cartoon here. Heat from the building, creates this irregular melting zone, which in turn is going to trap fuel contamination and make the movement of that fuel much more problematic to determine. And that's complicated by the fact that it's very flat. You're talking about hydraulic gradients of, perhaps 1 metre over 100 metres or more shallow. So it's almost like dropping water on a billiard table. You're not quite sure which direction it's going to go in. So a complication to this was that, what do you do if you have a large fuel spill with, several feet of fuel on the surface? You put down foam, firefighting foam on it, which as we all know now contains a lot of PFAS. Those in turn migrated into the lake, which was at that time a source of drinking water for the community. So you have a community which has been exposed to these compounds in their drinking water for maybe 40, 50 years now. So a number of challenges in this particular site. The cleanup liability still belongs to the US Navy, and they are actively pursuing a number of projects to address this. But it's very slow. The local community, which now owns this site, is unhappy with the progress, and that's further complicated by health impacts for emerging contaminants such as PFAS. To talk a little about some of the impacts of climate change, and I really like this picture because it shows you the permafrost, and you can see how close to the surface it is at this particular location. You can also see, though, that the mechanism of erosion of the coastline is a little bit unusual to what we might see in the UK. And what tends to happen is that the cliff is undercut so that large sections of permafrost blocks fall out into the ocean. And that obviously is exacerbated when you have very stormy weather. It's also an issue when you don't have sea ice present, which tends to protect the coastline to some extent because the wave action can't reach the cliffs essentially. And because of warmer climates, there are fewer days when sea ice is present all the way to the shore. So that tends to be exacerbated. So in terms of shoreline erosion, the areas in red on this map of the Arctic Ocean, the Beaufort Sea, there's almost 3 meters of erosion per year on average on those kind of red dotted spots there. So you can see over the course of 50 years, you can lose large linear distances of coastline. And that means that perhaps a landfill that was created to accept drums that was maybe 100 meters away from the coastline in the 1970s is now being exposed by the action of waves. And unfortunately, it's quite common to walk along the coast and see kind of areas of these being exposed there. Another big issue for Alaska is just the viability of some of these coastal villages from rising sea levels. And at least 3 communities that I know of have opted to relocate, obviously at great expense to do that. Great. So another issue for the poor people doing remediation in these areas is wildlife. This was a picture I took of a polar bear at Point Barrow, where they come in to feed in some of the discarded whale carcasses that you can see there. So whenever you're doing any work in the Arctic, ideally you want to have a bear guard with you. Though in practice, these bears are quite skittish, and there's not really been a huge number of attacks recorded over time, but they're still pretty scary animals, but you have to be aware, obviously, of your surroundings there. All right, so just to kind of finish up, I'd just like to summarize some of the remediation lessons from the Arctic and some of the issues of kind of working there. Really, the first point I want to make is that the climate change really is changing a lot of previous assumptions, especially to where you can safely bury waste within the community. That's important because most of the landfills that are operated in these communities in the North Slope Borough are freeze-back landfills. So you don't have a liner on them as you would have in the UK. All the waste is put into the landfill and is relying on the waste, the garbage, freezing over time and essentially sealing any leakage from that. Of course, that model rapidly breaks down if in a warming Arctic. I haven't really talked much about alternative remediation strategies. You have a very short growing season, so much of the work that has been done on things like bioremediation haven't had a lot of traction in Arctic Alaska. The preferred method of dealing with contaminated soil is essentially to dig it up, put it in sacks, and then have it shipped out by barge during the summer, which is very expensive, but also not very sustainable for doing that. Another issue, and probably not just in Alaska, but the focus tends to be on characterizing a site, putting in wells monitoring, rather than doing active remediation on a site. Some of the projects that I had worked on in Prudhoe Bay on behalf of the operators, had been going through monitoring for maybe 15 years without any attempt to actually address the problem. And that, unfortunately, is very common because you can spend a couple of $1 million a year doing that monitoring, keeping the regulators at bay, as opposed to spending maybe hundreds of millions in actual remediation. And it's been perhaps far too easy for the oil companies to kind of push that down the road rather than addressing it. That's pretty much it. Hopefully we have some time for some questions, and I'd be happy to try and answer them.
Thank you very much, Keith. So I will I will start with a question that's in the chat, and then I have a couple more questions to ask as well. So Olga is asking, can empty fuel tanks be shipped out cheaper on barges to a processing facility?
The short answer is no. There is an incredible amount of scrap metal in some of these communities, and there's always been talk of letting some company come with a barge, helping themselves to all this scrap metal and shipping it out. But the reality is that it's not economic. So it tends to just stay there and rust, and it gets dealt with when it becomes a problem, which is also when it's much more expensive to deal with. And often the only option is to fly these drums out, which you can imagine is extremely expensive.
And the follow-up question is, what are the alternative remediation methods for tanks and waste fuel?
Well, there's a whole series of methods that could be used, that are used, in the UK and in the lower 48. Probably the most common one would be doing soil remediation, where you essentially put the soil through a furnace and burn off the hydrocarbons. In fact, in Prudhoe Bay, there used to be a facility that would do that. And that is, it's good in many aspects because it creates an end product that can be reused. The clean soil after thermal treatment can be reused, so it is a valuable resource. Where it becomes a problem in the Arctic is because you're creating air pollution. That has to be monitored, and it's very difficult to permit in Alaska because it's the federal government that issues the permits for air quality, and it's very difficult to get those permits. So it's much easier just to dig and dump, essentially.
Thanks, Keith. So I'm coming at this from a legal perspective, and I've seen some case studies from Canada as well, where some of the projects, were started before any environmental impact assessment regulations were even conceived and put in place, and we're seeing communities having to deal with the effects of it now. And you touched upon this very briefly, but what are the challenges there with this sort of multi-regulatory landscape in Alaska? Is there clarity on who's responsible for what? Is it the lack of perhaps some liability and remediation obligations on the industrial actors, or lack of political will? What do you think the main political issues and legal issues are?
Well, I think everybody understands the legal framework fairly well. The state of Alaska has jurisdiction for contaminated sites. They maintain the database, and if you're a property owner, it's definitely in your interest to get off that list by cleaning up your property. The reality is a lot of the smaller sites, the people that own them just don't have the resources to clean them up. So they're very much dependent on either some of the bigger actors, such as the military, who have very deep pockets, of course, or getting grants to do cleanups and specific projects. The state has the authority to, force a landowner to clean up a site. But with almost 8,000 in the state, it's very difficult to enact that. A lot of these sites are now owned by what are known as native village corporations. So the real estate is owned by these community groups, and it's difficult to pressure them into doing cleanup when they have essentially inherited the problems.
Thank you, Keith. Can I open the floor to see if anyone else has any questions or comments? You can raise your hand or you can type it in the chat. I don't see any just now. So to take some time for myself again, I'm wondering what you're working on now. So it seems like that research is done and complete. Are you still working on a project? And if not, what are your future aspirations?
Yes, that's good. I moved from Alaska to take a position at the university, and for the last 5 years, I've been working on one specific project, which is looking at the circular economy with respect to dredged sediments from ports and harbours. So that's kept me busy until now. I'm actually planning to retire from the university in April. So I'll be looking to stay involved in some projects, but not to the same extent. I was very excited to hear when the University of Strathclyde joined the University of the Arctic, because I've still got a lot of connections in Alaska and people I still work with to some extent. And it's really got unlimited scope in terms of potential research that can be done there. So much things that are very poorly understood. And it's a beautiful state to visit. It's a great place to work. And the villages, the people in these communities, Indigenous communities, are really great people to deal with. Tremendous culture in places like ScAN.
Thanks, Keith. I think when you were showing the photos of the Alaska science stations, there's a new season of a show called True Detective out,
Yes.
and it's yes, I think it's definitely going to put it even more than it is now as a tourist destination. And there's a little spoiler for everyone. There's a mysterious crime happening in a science station in a village in Alaska. So
Yes. Well, yeah. Well, sadly, a lot of these communities have very high crime rates. There's a lot of drug abuse. There's a lot of other things going on. So that they're often, although they can look, very beautiful, often there's really a dark side to them.
There's a lot of legacies of industrial development as well. I haven't been to Alaska, but we had a tour to communities in Newfoundland in Canada. When the main employer is a big mine or a couple of mines, and then it does bring with itself a specific culture, but also the decline in socioeconomic indicators when the production declines as well. Okay, any further questions?
Yeah, and just kind of one last point for people that are maybe interested in visiting. Most of these communities are dry. You can't buy alcohol. You can't bring in alcohol. With a couple of exceptions, places like Nome, for example. So it is. But despite that, of course, there's high levels of alcoholism and drug abuse.
I think we have a question from Olga and then from Christopher.
I can't hear you too well, Olga.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. So a really interesting talk. Thank you. My company, Gentian, is doing biodiversity mapping in various places, and we start to work with large corporates on reporting, nature reporting within international frameworks, biodiversity frameworks. So I'm just wanted to ask, where would the money mainly come from to Alaska for remediation? Would that be the oil companies, the mining companies, or federal money?
Well, it's all basically federal money, primarily from the military. They are the most active in remediating their liabilities in the state, and they have the money that's needed to do these kind of projects, some of which can last 10, 20 years because of the limited field season there.
So what about the big oil in the North Slope? Are we doing anything significant?
Well, the short answer is no, because they're waiting for Prudhoe Bay to kind of cease operating, and that's when they want to do the remediation. You know, one concern is that some of the bigger oil companies have already sold their assets in Prudhoe Bay, most notably BP. So in theory, that liability should still be held by BP, and they would then have to come back and do the remediation. But it's such an onerous liability for them that they want to push that off as long as possible. Interestingly, the lease that was made with the state, because most of Prudhoe Bay is in state-owned land, was that it would be returned to its original condition. Or a condition that's satisfactory to the state, but that could really mean anything. Would you pull up all the roads? Who knows? It would, you know, it could be a huge liability to return it back to kind of tundra. There is exploration ongoing, and there have been some new fields that have been developed further west from Prudhoe Bay. The companies that tend to be operating now in Prudhoe Bay tend to be smaller oil companies that are very good at getting the last few barrels of oil out of some of these older fields. Much the same, I think, as is happening in the North Sea in Scotland. But there is a concern that, you know, when the boom is over, that the state will be left to pick up the pieces and do the cleanups.
Thanks, Keith. Christopher?
Thank you, Keith. It's nice to hear what you have to say about the Alaska experience in terms of remediation challenges. And of course, a bit of background about my organization. We're an Interreg program called the Northern Periphery and Arctic Program. And what brought my attention to when I saw that the ScAN group was having this presentation, I thought, well, let's go and listen to what's happening somewhere else, because we have a specific objective and actually a program priority dealing with climate change and strengthening and adapting for communities to be efficient. And inside of that, we sort of have an aspect dealing with risk prevention. And so listening to what you had to say today, I thought, ooh, there may be some connectivity here in what we're doing in our programming, knowing that we have money available for organizations that can come together to make a project. And I've got a sense that, I don't know if you reached out to other countries in what we would call the Northern European Arctic, to find out what sort of things are going on there. So we could give the example quite easily of Greenland, which has some exactly very similar conditions to Alaska, and Greenland's part of our programming area. You know, has there been some connectivity? And of course, this network that you're part of, I think, could be an ideal stepping stone to start to think about how can we get involved with other Europeans that may be able to tap into money. Now, that being said, Scotland's not able to tap into the European money at the current moment, but it's to think, is there something happening there? And that basically, that's my question, is, are there other things going on? I mean, you've got a network, and are people talking to themselves about this? Because as you point out, and we know quite clearly that in the North, we do see the climate having its effect on communities, on the environment. And it's not just a sort of, oh, it may happen, it is happening. We see it, and you demonstrated that with a few photographs. So it's like, is there something going on there? And so I'm throwing out a bit of a horseshoe to see if someone will pick it up and see if we can throw it back at each other and see if we can have a game and go further there.
Right. Well, there is a lot going on. I think it's primarily done through the Arctic Council, you know, which tends to have quite a high level of participation by some of the Arctic communities in that. I've not really had very much involvement in that, though.
Okay. I know that we we can tap into some European money now that I think Horizon agreements have been done.
Yeah.
And I have not been directly involved, but I know that there's a really big project called Just North, which has dealt with justice issues in the Arctic, and I think remediation was one part of it. It's led by Karine Wood Donnelly out of Bodo in Norway. And there's a call out, I think, now on the horizon as well for resilient Arctic communities. I'm not sure how much of that is about remediation rather than preparation to climate adaptation. And my feeling is it's often sort of separated, sort of, well, that's in the past and it's done. But I think, yeah, any sort of justice conversations cannot really be just about the future. It have to be about addressing the existing issues as well. So something for me to consider with my just transition hat on as well. Thank you, Keith. Is there any other questions? Okay, so I think we will conclude at this stage. Thank you again, Keith, for your presentation and for everyone for joining us today.